It began as a murmur in Detroit's manufacturing halls, but it did not remain silent for long. America's streets trembled as Ford, the behemoth that put generations to work and kept America's roadways running, did the unthinkable. It closed its production lines in the United States. Thousands of workers were sent home, whole facilities went silent, and the familiar buzz of Ford's assembly lines was replaced with uncertainty and terror. What might cause one of America's most recognizable enterprises to come to a halt? It was not a foreign competitor. It was not a strike. Tariffs were imposed directly from Washington rather than across the Atlantic. President Trump's aggressive America First trade war targeted foreign goods, but the shot fell straight in the heart of American manufacturing, costing Ford a stunning $1.45 billion in 25 alone. It was a measure intended to safeguard American employment, but it shook the car industry to its very core. And how did Trump react? It was not what anybody had expected, and it sent boardrooms throughout America scurrying. As the car industry deals with rising pricing, vacant showrooms, and a crumbling supply chain, one issue remains. Is this how America First truly looks? And who will be standing when the dust settles? May 16th will be remembered as the day Detroit held its breath. The lines at the Chicago facility, where hundreds of Ford Explorers and Lincoln Aviators were previously produced, have come to a halt. Workers at Michigan Assembly, the birthplace of the famous Bronco and Ranger, packed their toolkits and waited for a call that never arrived. Entire shifts vanished, and the manufacturing floor's hum gave way to an unnerving calm. Thousands of employees were advised to go home. There is no precise return date or answers, simply an echo of doubt in the air. For many, they were more than simply employment. They were lifelines, family legacies, and the prospect of a stable future. However, the cause of this suspension was neither a lack of demand or a failing business. Tariffs of 25% were imposed on imported components and automobiles, a move intended to restore jobs, but which instead sent them tumbling downward. The steel that made these automobiles, the electronics that powered them, and the batteries that propelled them all became too expensive to handle. Ford faced a staggering $1.5 billion profit cut in 2025, and the hard fact was clear. Even a behemoth like Ford couldn't swallow that expense without hurting. The shockwaves did not end at Ford's gates. Across the Midwest, the ripple effect spread as suppliers stopped, dealers fretted, and employees gazed at idle plants, wondering how long they could hold out. When the factory lights went out, the shock did not end at the assembly line. It infiltrated every showroom, dealership lot, and customer's wallet. With parts now subject to a 25% tax, Ford's response was straightforward, although painful. Hike prices. The Mustang Mach-E, Maverick, and Bronco Sport, models that formerly drew crowds because of their affordable pricing, now cost roughly $2,000 more overnight. Dealerships felt the pressure initially. Cars that used to fly off the lot started gathering dust as purchasers hurried to sign paperwork before the next price increase. Some attempted to lock in outdated rates. Others simply walked away, astonished by price tags that appeared to increase by the week. Inventory dwindled quickly. Shipments from Mexico halted, components from China delayed at ports, and models that had previously filled large lots began to disappear. Ford made a desperate effort by implementing employee pricing for everyone, a benefit often reserved for the bleakest days when sales tanks required rescuing. However, this time, it was more than just moving metal. It was also for survival. Nonetheless, the math failed to add up. Steel costs more, electronics cost more, batteries cost extra, and each automobile that did come off the assembly line had a price that put more buyers out of reach. The sticker shock extended beyond Ford, with Toyota, Honda, and Nissan also feeling the heat as the supply chain crumbled under the weight of tariffs designed to protect, but instead suffocated. As Ford's facilities remained silent and costs rose, all eyes went to Washington, hoping for a lifeline, or at least a hint of care. But President Donald Trump did not blink. When reporters questioned him on Ford's production stoppage, he did not describe it as a catastrophe. He labeled it expected. In his opinion, these tariffs were achieving precisely what they were designed to, compelling corporations to return production to American soil. They should have brought production back a long time ago, he asserted, sticking to his America First commitment even as facilities closed and people sat idle. The message was clear. There would be no retreat, policy change, or stop, no matter how loud the warnings from Detroit and elsewhere got. That comment sent shivers down the spines of executives across America. If the president could ignore Ford's difficulties, who would be next? General Motors, Stellantis, and other suppliers that relied on worldwide component networks began to reconsider everything: where to manufacture, what to construct, and how to survive. It was no longer simply about steel or electronics taxes. It was about a fundamental change in how American manufacturing would operate. For Trump, the agony was justified by the promise of a reshored industry. However, for manufacturers facing soaring costs and decreasing markets, the question was no longer patriotism, but survival. And as the president remained unmoved, the industry scrambled, forced into a new reality in which every choice carried risk, every delay resulted in more losses, and every day of quiet from Washington seemed like another nail in the coffin of the old American auto industry. Behind every closed industrial door was a family, a paycheck, and a community that relied on those earnings to keep the lights on and food on the table. When Ford sent employees home, the consequences extended well beyond the production floor. In Kokomo and Toledo, places that had previously survived recessions with grit, whole shifts were eliminated, leaving workers with vacant calendars and shrinking money. Small companies that relied on the buzz of the auto industry, diners selling early morning breakfasts, repair shops mending workers' cars, and small grocery stores counting on consistent paychecks, felt the pain immediately. Foot traffic halted, debts piled up, and murmurs of concern grew into loud discussions about how long these villages could hold out. Indiana's labor boards have issued concerns about growing unemployment. Mayors in Michigan begged Washington for help before their towns fell apart. However, the tariffs remained in place, and Washington's silence became increasingly pronounced. Workers who had formerly assumed that America First would secure their employment faced a grim reality. Every job created in Indian truck manufacturing was counterbalanced by one lost in Michigan's components factories. It devolved into a vicious exchange, with one family benefiting at the expense of another. The layoffs were not simply figures on a spreadsheet. They were parents explaining to their children why vacations were canceled, supper was smaller, and Christmas could be different this year. The true cost was measured not just in billions of dollars wasted by companies, but also in futures slipping away one paycheck at a time. For decades, the North American automotive sector functioned like a beautifully tuned engine. Parts from Mexico, electronics from China, assembly lines in Canada and the United States, all working in tandem to produce millions of automobiles at cheap costs. It was a system based on efficiency, speed, and scale, meant to keep prices down while providing the trucks and automobiles that Americans desired. But when the hammer of tariffs fell, the system began to crumble. Ford couldn't suddenly click its fingers and relocate all production to the United States. Neither could GM nor Stellantis. Their supply networks had taken decades to develop, were cross-border in nature, and relied on partnerships that could not be replaced immediately. Companies are now making decisions based on survival rather than efficiency. Orders were canceled, shipping were halted, and production lines were rerouted in a chaotic game of musical chairs. Some Indiana firms expanded shifts to avoid tariffs, while facilities in Michigan and Windsor closed, resulting in job losses as parts became too expensive to import. Dealerships suffered with inventory shortages, suppliers experienced unexpected order adjustments, and the steadiness that previously typified the car industry evaporated. It wasn't simply a few plants going black. It was the breakdown of a cross-border ecology that had sustained wealth for centuries. Every step became a gamble. Shift production here, raise prices there, and hope the buyers understood. But the larger issue persisted. Tariffs intended to preserve American employment were now splitting the same structure that allowed the sector to grow, forcing workers and businesses to navigate a terrain in which the old rules no longer applied. Ford is not gone, not yet. But for the first time in years, it is reeling, rethinking its place in the country it helped construct. Workers who have put in decades of sweat and talent now confront empty shifts and receding dreams, while towns that once prospered on the assembly line watch as lights flicker out one by one. Tariffs intended to defend American employment ended up shaking the basis of a whole sector. Prices rose, jobs migrated, and the promise of America First exposed a harsh reality. Protectionism may cost as much as it promises to save. Now, the American car industry is at a crossroads, torn between survival and principle, heritage and innovation. As exports decline and global competition emerges, the question remains, was it worthwhile? And as quiet falls over Detroit's once busy streets, only time will tell if this risk was a watershed moment for American industry or a lesson in steel and silence.